Cassils. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. How are you?
I'm good. For sort of an intro of this, do you mind just saying a little bit about your practice? What's what you make, what you've been thinking about recently?
Yeah, sure. My name is Cassils. I'm trained, I guess, as a visual artist. I initially studied, I guess, painting, and as a wee human, that's all I did was draw and paint. Um, and then I discovered performance and the body and the sort of delight of what you were just talking about, which is this ability to engage people in real time and space and experience a sort of exchange of energy. And so I've been working in performance for many years now. In addition to performance, I also make films and sound pieces, and I work with photography and everything from ceramics to glass blowing to bronze. So I've worked in many different mediums, and I'd say there's a strong bent to my work that deals with I guess trans and non-binary representation. um, and I also like to make work in community with other folks. So I've done quite a few collaborations over the last few years, but even the works that are deemed as more solo works are works that happen with just a myriad of collaborators and people that come together to help me manifest works, and just always thinking about like what it is to be an artist, to drop into space, and also like what is it to make work for like um, the trans community. Like as I grew up, I really didn't have those spaces or works that kind of created, invited in people like myself. And so I try to think about, how we can do that for each other now, because we can. And that's a little bit about me. How about you? Please tell me about yourself and your practice.
Sure. So I am an artist and filmmaker. I originally started in a more traditional filmic sense and wandered into art accidentally, and I feel like a lot of my decisions as an artist and video maker, photographer, performance artist, filmmaker, etc., all sort of come out of that, like that sort of falling into it, the sort of accident of it. But my practice, I'm very much interested in the individual and their relationship to the world around them, and this can be in the like the incredibly micro, the day to day, the sort of banality of that, the awkwardness of intimacy, one's relationship to their body, one's relationship to their gender, and the questions start to get larger from there. The self and their relationship either to systems or structures or governance, but they always sort of recenter on the self, um, specifically, usually using me as a stand-in for the questions. And the work is super colorful and playful, and I oftentimes am known for using cheap detritus and these sort of playful things that either become extensions of myself or props or um, you know world building that the work lives in.
I really loved how you were talking about this idea of thirdness, but also about the way in which you're talking about representation, because you use yourself in your work, but also thinking about, when you're talking about awkwardness, like the use of the lens, using close-ups, thinking about the way in which we can almost create these sort of abstract versions of intimacy, and this idea of like when representing self or when representing queer subjectivity. I'm one thing I'm thinking about a lot is just how we're in this moment, which is pushing for representation, 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 and yet we're not really there in terms of a society, because, as we all know, there's like so much violence that continues to occur. And so I think a lot about, when we're thinking about self, or we're thinking about the representation of like a queer or trans body in this moment. I was really enjoying some of the tactics that you choose to unravel some of those problems around looking. And I was wondering if you could um, speak to or maybe expand on some of those tactics that you've chosen, because I find them to be really compelling.
Yeah. Um, wow, question. It's been a minute. But I was actually weirdly reading passages from the Cautious Project a couple of days ago. This was a body of work from a couple of years ago, and I usually don't speak about this way, but it sort of started out making this work about this really intense, really short relationship that I had in my life that it ended probably about 6 to 8 times in a couple of month period. And so when the in both the midst of it, but also sort of it ending, I sort of used it as fodder to sort of ask these questions about, well, one, what was this person? Who were they? And how close could I actually have ever been to this person? And what was it actually mostly just in my own mind?
Mm.
Um, and because of this sort of intense like presence and then absence, I think we would use the word ghosting now, that a lot of it I've sort of left me thinking like, whoa, what did I what was it of an actual experience, and what was it that I self-constructed,
Mm.
and the sort of boundary of this whole relationship in my mind. And so the project, I ended up writing a novel out of it, a full-length film, a body of photographs, and I did many performances out of this short, really intimate moment, and sort of trying to unpack the idea of the relationship with the self and the potential other, and where does the boundary between this other body operate and just ourself. And so props and costumes and materials oftentimes we're stand-in for this potential other relationship, but also just for myself, and sort of trying to work out these dynamics. What I actually was just looking at the other day was this passage from the very first performance I had done, and I sort of it all sort of the first time this whole situation had erupted, I was performing that night in Boston. And it kind of just sort of exploded, like a couple of hours before going on stage. And I ended up writing this passage about this other body and referring to the body as it,
Mhm.
um, which is interesting to think about now in terms of my own transness. At that point, I was thinking about myself much more as a queer male body. But
Mm.
I think I actually like using the word it. I think them becomes more complicated. It ties more to a unique gender. But it for me was so much this possibility of an object, this love object. This
Mm.
this object in my mind. I kept on thinking of the killer from Stephen King's It. I kept on thinking
Mhm.
about it as this it doesn't even have to take the form of human form. It's this sort of abstract amalgamous thing that I've held so deeply onto, and it both can just sort of arrive and fall apart simultaneously. And I think this idea of like the abstract form, in this case being the relationship, but in other ways, I think has been really critical for me in terms of me sort of thinking about my own relationship to my own gender. Um, and as and sort of the idea of like in my own work, there's constantly never really an end goal, especially in my performances. There's always this act of trying things on. There's never really a resting point. And I think a lot of that language I really identify with, and sort of coming to terms with being both trans and non-binary, um, and sort of this act of trial and error and seeing where things sort of sit,
Mm.
and then wash off and then sort of become something else along the way. So I pulled a few questions for you that are honestly for me a little bit like therapy.
Mhm.
I'm curious about how your relationship to your own gender has developed alongside your practice. How's your practice grown, expanded, and reconsidered your own relationship to your own body?
I'd say about like starting in 2010 or 11, I really felt this desire to go into a deeply physical practice in a much more aggressive way. And I'd say that but early on, in terms of how I thought about gender in my work, I don't know if I would have had the words for that, because I'd say in 2000 and like 9 or 10, words like gender nonconforming, I hadn't heard that term. I did very much identify as trans, but I also was reticent about, full medical interventions, based on my own experience of having a lot of like illness as a child and not being listened to by doctors. And so I was kind of scared of surgery, scared of hormones, and also felt, that what did it mean at that time for like what I felt a certain pressure in the trans community to fully transition, or you weren't real, you know. Um, and so I think I turned to my work as a way to kind of carve out a space for my own expression. And an early work I made was a piece called Tiresias, where I worked with an ice sculptor to create a neoclassical Greek male torso out of ice, of like a sort of idealized male body. And it's based on a Greek myth. And Tiresias was transformed from a man into a woman for 7 years as a sort of penance. Um, and he's run through many different sort of depictions via paintings, or even symphonies. But I was interested in reinvigorating that figure, and I did a durational work where I would press my body against this idealized form and melt this like form with my own body heat. And it was really about this durational aspect of existing within this desire for this certain body, but also knowing that no body is stable. And that, like, I guess, to dovetail into your question about trans, for me, trans is really about that very notion of constantly shifting sand around a sort of mutation and a kind of slipperiness that is unstable, and that it allows for, as many ways as we can talk about defining trans or non-binary, all of those definitions are valid. And I feel like my definition that I maybe had 10 or 12 years ago has absolutely changed, as the vocabulary has changed, as I've been able to witness more creative process from other artists, felt less alone, been able to have those engagements, get feedback and give feedback. All of that has certainly shaped and created a visual vernacular, but also a verbal vernacular. And I really believe that, like, one of the reasons I've always been motivated to make visual work is because that's the way I think. I see things way before I can speak them. And I think in a way my early work was very much about giving me a space to have agency and exist, because otherwise I don't think I would have done very well. Um, I mean, and by that I mean mentally. It was a way of kind of surviving. And I feel like as artists, it's a real gift that we have to give to the world, but also to ourselves, is that we have this ability to create a slice of agency. What we make, what we create, what we do, how we treat each other, that is our agency, and nobody can take that from us. So I feel like um, my early work was very much in relation to uh, exploring things that I did not yet have words for. Um, so that's a long-winded answer. And I think to kind of finish the question, I'd say the work changed quickly, because I think early on I started to feel frustrated that people would become hung upon the fetishization of like my body, and there was so much more going on in the work than just the representation of my body. And I started to experiment with abstraction in ways of removing my body, because I didn't want the work to be about just me. I wanted it to be, not to say that there's anything wrong with artists that do that. I think that that's very valid. But for me, it was like I didn't want it to stop at my subjectivity. And I was interested in talking about sort of more, I wanted to have dialogues around like larger social issues than just my own experience. Um, and so I started to work with abstraction and with the indexing of outputs of bodies, like everything from piss to sweat to shit. And I became interested in plunging the viewers into darkness, denying them the ability to look, and really creating these very visceral corporal experiences where I would hijack the body of the viewer and kind of call into a sort of complicity what it meant for them to look and what it meant for them to be physical and present. And so I'd say like the trajectory of my work went from being works that was rooted in my own self-image to being works that are really much more expansive and abstract. Um, so that's a long answer, but there you have it. I guess I do want to know, is there anything that you're working on right now that you want to tell us about?
I just finished some. I am, but like it's so early. I just finished a video that on, sort of the first time really asking the questions around gender
Mm,
in my work. I feel like it's one of those things that I haven't really been ready to kind of communicate in a full length form, and sort of work through my own narrative of sort of where I kind of got myself to here. It's interesting looking at the essay, the text, because it was written about a year ago. So it's like looking back of myself,
mm,
already a year past.
mm,
The video is recent, and in that, seeing like see the growth and the development of it, and sort of seeing like so many different like reflecting moments where I was then writing, where I am now making this work, where I was at the time I was thinking about the questions, where I was as a child, etc. And the videos made with these little like paper cutouts of myself, a variety of different attires and clothing of me through this process. And they're sort of all kind of melded together. So you see me with short hair and long hair and glasses and skirts and up 10 pounds, down 20 pounds, etc. So for me, I think that's sort of like finishing that project has been sort of like it's been a little bit of a resting point as I slowly get started. Sort
mm.
of like, okay, well, what are my next questions? What are the things that can kind of come after this? And how can I integrate this new body into an artistic practice, or performance-based practice? What about yourself? What are you working on? What are you thinking about? What have you recently finished?
I think I've been thinking about what we've been talking a lot about, which is like, how does one hold the sort of darkness of our current reality and also light? Like, how do we hold the precarity and the violence and just like the darkness of what we've been through, not only with pandemic, but this like last 4 years, you know? And how do we also hold on to ways of creating hope, generative techniques, like imagination, investigation, inspiration, and like I think I've been trying to figure out ways of allowing for works to express both at once, as opposed to trying to choose or force one or the other. And so, yeah, I have a new work that I'm working on that I think will, we'll see. As you said earlier, like you said, you were interested in failure. I do think, risk is really important. And sometimes failure is generative. So I feel like I'm in an experimental moment myself. So I have this like new dance work that's going to open. It's going to open in the UK at a space called Home in Manchester. And I also have an exhibition that's also coinciding with that main stage event that will also open. So I'm just like furiously plugging away with that. But I would love to come see your work in person now that we can do that. So please, let's
Yeah,
stay
let's
in
do it.
touch. I'd love to, and like just let's hang out. Let's have some
Yeah,
lunch or some sweet smoothies
yeah,
and walk scout. It's really nice
perfect.
to meet you.
Yeah, let's do it. I love it.